Hello guys, Oscar Hotel 8, Sierra Tango November here from Survival Tech Nord. Today's topic, a new series on amateur radio emergency communications. But we're not talking about public service emergency communications, we're talking about emergency communications for preparedness. Now there definitely are some overlaps, however, these two disciplines are not entirely the same. So we're going to talk about the grid down scenario. We're going to talk about the mission. We're going to talk about communications gear. But we're also going to talk about some of the practical tools we have in the amateur radio community, allowing effective communications with your people. Now, I'm not going to lie to you, this is definitely going to be a tough video for the newcomer. This video has some new and abstract ideas which may at times seem foreign to many of us. But I promise you, if you stick with it, if you make it through this video, you'll be able to put together an effective communications strategy for grid down communications with your people. So stick with me for episode 1 of Amateur Radio for Preparedness.
You are listening to the Emergency Broadcast Systems. This station broadcasts emergency news and official information on the air for assigned area.
I think the first thing we should do is talk about the hard things. Now, it may be much more popular to talk about the zombie apocalypse, but in today's world, your communications or your grid-tied communications are most likely going to be affected by a natural disaster. Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Irma, Hurricane Maria. Never mind the tornadoes, the nor'easters, the wildfires, or the blackouts. One thing is certain. During a disaster, you pick up that telephone, no one's coming to help you. Emergency services are simply going to be overloaded. And despite all the propaganda about how well we did in Puerto Rico's energy infrastructure is just as fragile as it was before Hurricane Maria. But we're not here to lay blame on anyone, we're actually here to make a point. And that point is, responsibility for our emergency communications and emergency power during a grid down scenario is entirely our own. We need to be in complete control of our power and communications. Now, unfortunately, there's a huge disconnect between amateur radio emergency services and emergency communications for preparedness. Traditionally, amateur radio emergency communications has focused on emergency communications for public service. When we talk about emergency communications for preparedness, we have a couple of different goals. First of all, we're trying to gather news and information from both inside and outside the disaster zone. This allows us to ascertain whether or not our current course of action fits the scenario as it exists right here, right now. Now, we also have a secondary goal, and that is implementing a strategy for effective communications with our family, our friends, our group, or basically establishing communications with our people. Now, before we start talking about what radios we're going to need or what gear we're going to use, we need to talk about the scenario and the mission, because it's these two aspects of the discussion which will define everything else. One of the mistakes we often make is trying to prepare for a very specific scenario. Lots of folks are focusing on pandemics, earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes, economic collapse, or a variety of different scenarios. I'd like to encourage you to think in more generic terms. So I'm asking you to think about communications preparedness from the perspective of the grid down scenario. From a communications perspective, the grid down scenario is absolutely the worst case. So, being prepared for a grid down scenario means we'll also be prepared for 99% of the eventualities we might experience in a disaster. So how do we define the grid down scenario? Well, your power is probably out, your telephone, your landline telephone isn't working, your mobile phone can't connect to the network. Local television and radio stations are either inaccessible, not broadcasting, or not broadcasting the information which is relevant to your situation. But probably the hardest from all of these things is not being able to reach out to the people you care about. Despite evidence to the contrary, getting in touch with our people will actually become one of our highest priorities. But now that we understand this scenario, we can actually start talking about our mission or what our communication goals actually are. Our first mission objective is collecting as much intelligence about this scenario from inside and outside the disaster zone as possible. Once we've collected enough intelligence or information about the scenario as we can move on to the second step, which is planning our next course of action. So after collecting intelligence and information about the scenario, after using that intelligence to decide on a course of action, we can actually now start establishing communications with our people. In other words, we find out what's going on, we decide what we're going to do, and then we let everybody know. Now, I do understand how this might appear to be a vast oversimplification. However, we want to keep our steps simple so that we don't create a moving target from our own communication strategy. Now, assuming you've already established a place to hunker down and get a stock of the situation, the very first thing we want to do is start gathering news and information about the disaster. We're going to start with the easiest sources first, so that's going to be the radio and television, like you do every morning or every day when you come from work. We check these first because there's no special equipment required to do so. You use your radio and your television. Now, since this doesn't require any special skills, everyone knows how to use a radio and a television. Anyone can do that task from your group, leaving your radio operator free to focus on more advanced communications if the need arises. It's also a safe way to find out what's going on since you don't have to become exposed to do so. We're going to check local FM radio, local AM radio if it still exists in your area. Now, even though we're talking about a grid down scenario, local television, cable television, and satellite are important sources of information. Broadcasters will always try to continue broadcasting provided they have the power to do so. If you can take advantage of this resource without dipping into your energy reserves, you can go ahead and check those too. Here's something to consider. The longer the disaster lasts, the more likely it is you'll find local news outlets have run out of power. There are other sources of information about a weather event, for example. Now, if you're lucky enough to be in North America, the North Americans have the NOAA Weather Service. The NOAA Radio Service, or Weather Radio, is a network of VHF radio stations providing news and information about the weather. It also broadcasts disaster alerts related to weather events. NOAA Weather Radio broadcasts are available to the public provided the public has the correct type of radio to listen in on those transmissions. I'll leave you some examples of good weather radios in the episode notes. Now, if you already have the amateur radio capabilities to do so, repeaters on VHF and UHF are an excellent way of gathering news and information about a local scenario. In the real world, repeaters are responsible for doing the heavy lifting for us. They take what they hear on an input frequency and retransmit that out over the air on an output frequency. That's what we hear in our radios. Now, if you have local repeaters in your area, it's either going to be analog or digital, and if it's digital, it's going to be one of a few different types or standards. It's pretty difficult for anyone else to tell us what type of repeaters we have in our own areas, so we need to do the research. One of the research tools I use is an app for Android and iOS called Repeater Book. Repeater Book allows us to search by location for repeaters in our area. We can also use it to search areas we're going to be in but aren't there yet. I'll leave information about Repeater Book in the episode notes. Now, repeaters, just like us and just like our television and radio broadcasters, they're also affected by the grid down scenario because they're usually located in the same geographic area as we are. So it's important to keep in mind not basing your entire communications plan on the expectation of a repeater being there during a grid down scenario. Finally, it's important to understand that if things are really that bad, if the disaster is bad enough, if the grid has gone down for long enough, we don't want to be transmitting through the repeater. So we maintain our security by using these repeaters in a receive-only capacity. Now this brings us to shortwave radio. From an information gathering perspective, shortwave radio is probably going to be the most important asset you have. Not only are you able to use your shortwave radio to receive news and information from outside the disaster zone, you are also able to receive news and information from the perspective of people outside the disaster zone. Very often, local news and authorities will play down an event, and they do this to avoid spreading any more panic than there already is. By using our shortwave radios, we can actually validate the information we're getting from local authorities, if any, allowing us to make an informed decision about bugging in or bugging out. So now we've been able to go through news and information gathering. You've learned about the variety of sources we use to gather news and information in order to make an informed decision about bugging in, bugging out, or the situation on the ground in the disaster zone. So now that we understand the scenario, we understand the mission and the mission objectives, we can now take a look at the equipment we'll use for this aspect of emergency communications for preparedness. We're going to call this our basic comms kit. The primary function of our basic comms kit is news and information gathering. However, it would be practical to include local and regional communications capabilities. One often overlooked aspect of emergency communications is understanding what should go in our basic comms kit. There's no point in starting to buy radio equipment before we understand the capabilities we actually require for our mission objectives. So rather than talking about specific equipment, we talk about the requirements versus the capabilities of the equipment. Anything else is absolutely putting the cart before the horse. So from a capabilities perspective, we're looking for local broadcast AM and FM radio. We're looking for a radio with weather capabilities. We're looking for a radio with shortwave capabilities. We're looking for a VHF, UHF handy talkie or mobile radio. And naturally, we're looking for batteries and a renewable power source to keep it all running in a grid down scenario. Now, much of this is abstract, but none of it is impossible. Now, when we're putting together that basic comms kit, it's important to overlap capabilities. Overlapping the capabilities of your gear and your basic comms kit is one way to achieve communications continuity. Although the gear choices for your basic comms kit are entirely your own, I do encourage you to keep comms continuity in mind when you're choosing your gear. When we look at this example mock-up of a basic comms kit, we can see I have a battery and charge controller, I have a solar panel, I have a Yaesu FT817 or 818, I also have a VHF UHF tri-band handy talkie, I also have a shortwave radio, and finally a tablet. Each of the radios overlaps in its capabilities with the other radios. Now, to be completely honest with you, it's not always practical to practice 2 is 1, 1 is none with communications gear, but we do achieve some level of communications continuity this way. Everyone from your mother to the range officer to your best friend is going to tell you what radio you need for emergency communications for preparedness. Smile politely in agreement, then walk away. Nothing other than the mission and the capabilities required to fulfill your comms objectives should be considered good advice regarding which gear to buy and use for emergency communications for preparedness. Certainly no one intends to mislead us regarding emergency communications, but we have to understand there is no one-size-fits-all solution. With that said, let's move to the next segment and talk about reestablishing communications with our people. This communications plan comes from a subscriber of mine who works in New Orleans but lives in Mississippi. So his dad and his family are there in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. His brother is over in Gulfport, and of course my subscriber is working just outside New Orleans. For the moment, the only radios they have are the VHF-UHF handy-talkies and some upgraded antennas. They plan on using the repeaters for grid-down communications. Let's take a look at how repeaters work and look at the pros and cons of this communications plan. So, repeaters work by listening on one frequency and retransmitting what they hear on another frequency. What comes out of the other frequency is what we hear when we're listening to a repeater with our VHF-UHF handy-talkie. In this scenario, the repeater is doing all the heavy lifting, and it allows us to use low-spec or low-capability VHF-UHF radios for our communications plan. This will all work fine as long as the repeater isn't shut down, it has power to operate, and it's not over-congested. It's also important to remember that if the repeater isn't actually operational, those VHF-UHF handy-talkies have a limited range. If you're close enough, have line of sight, and have nothing in between the person you're trying to contact, you can still use those VHF-UHF handies. This is called simplex communications. With simplex communications, the most important aspect is understanding the range of your communications equipment. Now let's talk about fallback communications in the event the repeaters are down. Now in a grid down scenario, it's very likely that your repeater, your local repeater, won't be accessible to you. It's probably going to be out of power. That's totally okay since we have anticipated the failure of local intermediate infrastructure. So when amateur radio operators can't access a local repeater, they actually use another form of communications called NVIS, or Near Vertical Incident Skywave. Until now, all of our station-to-station communications have been talking about VHF or UHF, and perhaps through a repeater. Now, when we're trying to alleviate the requirement of intermediate infrastructure, for example, repeaters, we need to move away from VHF and move down to HF. And one of the most amazing features we have on some HF bands is reflecting our signals off of layers of the atmosphere and back down to Earth. We do this using an HF radio on 40 meters, 60 meters, 80 meters, and 160 meter bands. If done correctly, this is an incredibly reliable technique which requires very little power to be successful. The caveat is HF radios are much more expensive than our VHF-UHF handy-talkies. With Near Vertical Incident Skywave, we can expect reliable communications with a very simple antenna setup for local and regional communications using a very small amount of power. Now, at the beginning of this video, I told you there's going to be some abstract concepts which are probably going to be overwhelming for the newcomer. HF data networks or mesh networking over HF is one of those concepts. Now, a few weeks before publishing this video, I published another video on NVIS communications with JS8 Call. JS8 Call is the application you're seeing on your screens right now. The reason I'm telling you about JS8 Call and mesh networking over HF is 1. There's no infrastructure requirement. 2. You don't have to be at the radio to receive a message from another station. 3. You can receive messages with a shortwave radio or SDR even if you're not a licensed AM radio operator. And 4. It's very slow, but it's an incredibly efficient means of communications. I like to think of JS8 Call and mesh networking over HF as a redundant social media network. We can send and receive messages, we can share our location, we can chat, and we can even do that directly or through any station we actually hear if we can't hear the station we want to communicate with. For those of you interested in mesh networking and JS8 Call over HF, I'll leave a link to that previous video in the description. Now there's one more topic I'd like to cover in brief before we shut down this video, and that is emergency power for communications. Now we've spent an incredible amount of time on this channel covering emergency power, portable power, and solar power for off-grid communications. In fact, I think if you've ever looked for information on YouTube for building these things, understanding how they work, and understanding how to deploy them effectively in the field, you would have come across my channel previously. So not only is it important to understand how they work, it's also important to understand why we need them. In reality, the only thing I really want to tell you about emergency power for communications is to make a dedicated system, either buy it or build it, a dedicated system for your communications gear. Make sure your emergency power can power your communications gear for 24 hours before you even need to plug it in or recharge it. Don't be fooled by something in a pretty box. We don't need to be a stylish hipster. We only care about performance, reliability, and portability. It's also important to understand the technology behind our emergency power. We need to understand the batteries, we need to understand what goes into the system, so that in the event it happens to go wrong during a grid down, we are able to repair it. Now, we often find a lot of information which makes this topic seem overwhelmingly complex, but at the end of the day, our portable power, or emergency power, is just made up of 3 components. We have a battery, which is the storage. We have a solar panel, which is the charger. That can be a wind generator as well. And we have a charge controller. These 3 components work together to ensure your communications stay up and running despite the lack of the grid. Now, whether you're operating off-grid in the field or grid down at home, you'll find some pretty incredible projects and information on the topic of portable and emergency power in the description. Alright guys, we've covered an enormous amount of material in this video, so let's just go through and recap. First of all, we had an introduction to amateur radio and communications for preparedness. Now, by no means was that meant to be sensational. It's simply telling the story as it exists today. Then we also covered news and intelligence gathering, putting together a basic comms kit, the concept of re-establishing communications with your people, and how it differentiates from the goals of amateur radio emergency services. We also covered VHF and UHF and using repeaters for preparedness, and how amateur radio operators use NVIS or near vertical incident skywave when the infrastructure is down. We also discussed how we use HF data modes and mesh networking to create our own type of social media network over the radio for preparedness. And finally, we ended the discussion on emergency and portable power for communications preparedness. I know this was a lot of information to cover, but I assure you, it's not the last of this type of videos coming from this channel. If you're supporting this channel through Patreon, PayPal, or simply sharing my content, you're absolutely magnificent, and I couldn't do it without you. For the rest of you, if you like what I'm doing, if you like the content I'm creating, leave me a comment and a thumbs up to let me know. And if it's not too much to ask, please share this video with someone or someplace where other operators might enjoy it. Rock and roll, guys. Thanks for watching. Ciao.